Joshua Blakeney to respond to what he's encountered as he begins his master's thesis on the origins of the global war on terror.
So thank you. It's an honor to sit here at this panel with his distinguished professors who are here, and hi to all the students in Lethbridge. So I guess I walked into Professor Hall's class in 2007, and he was at that time beginning to revise his position on 9/11 after being encouraged to look at the documentary record about 9/11 by his friend and colleague Splitting the Sky. Splitting the Sky is the man who on March 17, 2009 attempted a citizen's arrest on George W. Bush in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So as Professor Hall's student, he was beginning, for example, I witnessed him in class show for example, the explosion we see emanating from the Pentagon, which it's very difficult to see what exactly hit the Pentagon at that time. And so as Professor Hall was grappling with the big shock that what we were told about 9/11 by our governments isn't at all supported by any documentary evidence. As he was going through that thought process, I accompanied him on that journey, and ever since we've kind of pulled our resources, pulled our abilities to disseminate messages and information in order to attempt to participate in the quest for 9/11 truth. And so I did my undergraduate degree in sociology at the University of Lethbridge, and so often we hear this epithet conspiracy theorist invoked, and I think when one thinks about how ridiculous it is that we're supposed to be ashamed to be theorists about conspiracies. I mean, I took sociology, came out an avid Marxist, and any Marxist has to be a conspiracy theorist because you look at those who own capital and allege that they conspire together to retain their hegemony. And so I think a conspiracy is two or more people working together to achieve a common goal surreptitiously, and to have a theory about that is certainly nothing to be ashamed of, especially not in universities. And so Professor Hall and I have been negotiating this issue of 9/11. I'm also very interested in the Israel-Palestine conflict. I would participate in the anti-Iraq war protests in London in 2000, from when I was in my teens, 2003 onwards. And when I moved to Lethbridge, obviously it was a different situation, but I helped to found a Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights chapter at my university, and so I began to realize that the Israel-Palestine conflict, the assault against the Arab and Muslim peoples in the country that was wiped off the map, Palestine, and 9/11, they're not two separate issues, because Israel's fingerprints are all over 9/11, as well as elements within the United States government. And so I'm personally in my scholarship quite interested in attempting to see where these two subjects, which I used to view as two separate subjects, and which many people probably do view as two separate subjects, I'm interested in trying to uncover where they converge, because we kind of have seen a globalization of the Israel-Palestine conflict since 9/11. The idea that Arabs and Muslims are now perceived as the enemy of people in Britain and Canada and the USA. This happened because of different vested interests within the permanent war economy that we have on this planet. And so I think it's obviously people of our generation, it's kind of like JFK is to older generations. It's the most seminal event in our lives that changed our lives. Many of our generation, younger people, are now at war. It seems that you can't get a job nowadays in our society, and therefore people have to turn to jobs in the permanent war economy. We live in a society not of Keynesianism, but of military Keynesianism, and so I'm compelled to try and uncover the lies and crimes of 9/11 in order to help to oppose this military-industrial complex. Professor Trusello, you mischaracterized what I said. I didn't say Israel was behind 9/11, but I do think that there are two forbidden topics in the academy that professors increasingly lose their jobs, like Professor Norman Finkelstein did. And those two forbidden topics overlap, and they are the Israel-Palestine conflict and 9/11. On 9/11 there was a number of dancing Israelis, and I'm sure you know this, that on 9/11 there was a number of Israeli Mossad agents who were apprehended after they were seen celebrating the event which then led to Israel's enemies, Arabs and Muslims, being demonized, vilified, massacred, harried and hounded around the planet. Larry Silverstein, who confessed on TV, on PBS, to the controlled demolition of Building 7, as Professor Harrett shows, in his wonderful presentations. According to Haaretz, the liberal newspaper in Israel, he had a weekly telephone call with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister. If we deconstruct who the neoconservative movement was, take for example a prominent neoconservative, Douglas Feith, he lost his security clearance in the 1980s for passing classified documents from the US to the Israeli state, as did Paul Wolfowitz. He got caught disseminating classified documents to the state of Israel. And the thing is, Israel has a long history of, we're talking about the concept of false flag terrorism, where you do terrorism in order to frame someone who you'd like to do war against. And Israel, I heard one speaker say they kind of have a PhD in false flag terrorism, going back to the Lavon affair of 1954. They didn't want Britain to withdraw from the Suez Canal, Israel did, and therefore they went around bombing British strategic interests and tried to frame the Muslim Brotherhood and Egyptian communists. The USS Liberty, they sent out unmarked planes to attack a US ship, killing or maiming 70% of those on board, in order to entice the United States government into a war, to help Israel in its 6-day war as it colonized the Sinai. And so for me personally, you just talked about wanting to bridge cultural studies and 9/11 studies. As someone who's engaged with the scholarship, like Professor Walt and Mearsheimer. Walt is at Harvard University, Mearsheimer is at the University of Chicago Law School. They've made a compelling case that the Iraq War was for Israel. And I tell you what it comes down to is that there's a contradiction in the policy that the US has traditionally wanted strong men in the Middle East, a strong Middle East, so they can despoil and loot the resources of the Middle East. Israel has a diametrically opposite interest, which is a weak and divided and atomized and fragmented Middle East. And I do think it's really important for us to contemplate. I'm not saying, as you mischaracterized me, that Israel's behind this, but when I see that Mossad agents have been arrested on 9/11, when I see Professor Barrett so courageously week in, week out, speaking the truth about the Israeli dimension, I'm not saying that we've got a pretty picture here, that it's all Israel or it's all the US, but certainly to keep this in mind is very important if we want to actually find the truth about what happened. It reminds me of what you were saying, if I can just chip in. I walked into a computer science class at the University of Lethbridge as part of a science elective, and the professor showed us this kind of beast called a big dog, who was a robot on the screen, and it had a kind of logo saying Boston Corporation, and he said, well, if you study computer science hard and study robotics, you could be a programmer for robots that help the US military kill the terrorists in Iraq. And I think it was a good indication, because as a student I had this permanent war economy kind of being forced down my throat, as if that's what we're in. We're in a state of permanent war, and education has to it either conforms to that and gets lots of funding, or it doesn't conform, and we have to do things like this, on foundation funding, right?
Like Joshua was.
Dr. Kevin Barrett, who lost his job as a professor by the name of Kevin Barrett, who actually was so demonized and ostracized by particularly Fox News that he actually was not rehired, simply because he taught a class on Islam and said, well, according to polls, about 80% of Muslims don't believe the official story of 9/11, and therefore I feel obliged to dedicate 1 week to allow the students to have a contemplation of the conflicting interpretations of 9/11.
He was at the University of Wisconsin, which had a good reputation, but now that university's reputation, like NIST reputation, a very important agency, from our perspective, is very low. It's not a place that respects academic freedom. A politician in Wisconsin decided to go on a political campaign and tell the university who they should or should not hire, just as the editorial writer of the National Post went on a campaign to instruct the University of Lethbridge and the officials at the University of Lethbridge who should or should not get a scholarship, or to instruct us that Professor Hall may have his personal views on 9/11, but that should be kept exclusively as a personal matter. I shouldn't be treating this as curriculum. And so this is my answer.
I feel a lot of weight on my shoulders now. I've gone into this, that I am going to have to participate in the final quest, the end of this fact-finding mission the 9/11 Truth Movement have been on, which is to ascertain what happened on 9/11, and I hope to achieve that in my life. And it's also very difficult to say nowadays, like, well, what's Israel or what's the US? Because the state, since Reagan and Thatcher, has been so deregulated. Like Professor Hall coins the phrase the privatized terror economy, in his book, and I think that's a valid point. Like when I use the generalization Israel, I mean, I'm not talking about everyone in Israel, or you know, even the Israeli state. What is that nowadays? Because with this privatized terror economy, it's very we don't get a pretty picture, and I do agree that makes our quest for the truth. I think, after I saw Michael Sherman speak at my university, I mean, what most economists think, he was purporting to be a professor of economics. After we did a critical investigation of him, he actually deleted of economics. One of Tony's students, we were discussing 9/11 a few weeks ago, one of Tony's students put his hand up and said, so you're telling us about all this wicked and regrettable things that are going on the planet. What can we do? And I think when Professor McQueen just raised the point about universities being perhaps a vanguard or some kind of force towards a credible investigation, or just conducting a credible investigation, I think students can participate in that too. One very simple way to do this: every time your professors, and I'm sort of speaking to the students now, every time your professors use the epithet 9/11, 9/11, stick your hand up in the air and say, "Excuse me, Professor, you're paid to be a professor to read books. Could you define 9/11 for me, please? What happened on 9/11?" And then say, because I heard there's an academic dispute and David Ray Griffin's written 10 books, because as Professor Hall and I always say, you could disagree with David Ray Griffin's 10 books and Peter Dell's scholarship and the scholarship in the Journal of 9/11 Studies and so on. But you have to at least read it if you're a professor who wants to invoke 9/11. You could, for example, as one history professor at my university said, she said, well, it's too close, I'm not going to touch that. The war on terrorists, I'm a historian, I have to do ancient stuff, it's too close in a class on world history, we can't talk about 9/11. But as the years creep on, that's not going to be credible anymore. And so I think what students can do is just, and it will be subversive because it will force professors, especially if you, for example, invoke the very credible 10 books written by Professor David Ray Griffin, and that could be a kind of grassroots or a bottom-up approach to pressuring more academics to join with those who have looked into 9/11 and affect the change. Because I know that we were emphasizing the difference in the truth movement. It's such an interdisciplinary project, those who are participating in this quest for 9/11 truth. And I think there has been a shift since 1968 in what might be called post-1968 thought towards relativism, and that can be a very progressive thing, like cultural relativism, the idea that English people can't say they're better than Blackfoot people or Mohawk people. But I was wondering, maybe in your summary, Michael, Professor Trusello, you might just broach the subject of whether you feel that the idea that the 9/11 truth movement's mobilized in the quest for absolute truth, and often along the kind of class lines, working class people sort of disseminating DVDs on their weekends in the shopping mall, the very kind of things that many post-structuralists, post-anarchists tried to sort of reject or move beyond or kind of grow out of, and so I think that in summing up, that if we're going to participate in this quest for 9/11 truth, I mean, you talk about the death of the liberal class. I mean, the liberals were modernists, they weren't postmodernists, right? And I just would say that I think the concept of absolute truth, regardless of what we think about cultures, regardless of how we categorize humanity, whether it's along class or as individuals or on cultural and ethnic lines, I think it's so important that we all come together to agree, like Professor Hall said, this isn't a relative thing. Either there was explosives in those towers or there wasn't, and that's, I think, where the universities can really play an important role, a very basic role of distinguishing between fact and fiction.